Living alone in the remote forests of northern Maine was exactly what I wanted. After years of working as an engineer in the city, surrounded by noise and people, I craved solitude. I built my cabin with my own hands, tucked away from the world. It was peaceful, just me and the wilderness. I hunted, fished, and tended to the land. The rhythm of my days was simple and satisfying. For over a decade, I thrived in that isolation. I didn't miss the city at all. Forest had become my sanctuary, a place where I could live on my own terms. Silence was comforting, broken only by the sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the call of a distant bird, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But then, subtle changes began to creep in. I started feeling like I wasn't alone. At first, it was just a vague sensation, a tingling on the back of my neck, as if someone or something was watching me from the trees. I brushed it off, thinking I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. Then, I noticed my traps had been disturbed during the night. Nothing was caught, but it was clear that something had tampered with. Strange noises started to echo through the trees, rustling that didn't quite match the rhythm of the wind. Whispers seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to convince myself it was just the natural sounds of the forest, amplified by my solitude. After all, spending so much time alone can play tricks on your mind. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest, my peaceful refuge, was starting to feel less like home and more like a place I didn't fully understand. I tried to ignore it, to go about my days as usual. That sense of being watched never really left me. One night, when the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my cabin. It wasn't the familiar scurrying of animals or the rustle of leaves in the wind. These were deliberate, heavy steps, like someone or something was walking around, just outside my door. My heart pounded as I reached for my rifle, cold metal reassuring in my grip. I stayed still, listening intently. The footsteps paused, then started again, circling the cabin. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the wooden floor under my feet amplified in the silence. My breath caught in my throat as I moved towards the window, trying to catch a glimpse of what was out there. But all I could see was darkness, endless, impenetrable darkness. The forest, usually so alive with the sounds of nature, was eerily quiet. Not a single cricket chirped, not a single branch creaked. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. I stepped outside, rifle raised, my eyes scanning the tree line. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just the dense blackness of the forest, as if it was hiding something just out of sight. I could hear whispers, faint and unintelligible, carried on the wind. They seemed to come from all around me, closing in, making my skin crawl. Footsteps had stopped. The sense of being watched had only grown stronger. I could feel eyes on me, from the shadows, from the trees, from the very darkness itself. My pulse quickened as I backed up towards the cabin, every instinct telling me to get inside, to find some semblance of safety behind locked doors. Once inside, I bolted the door and sat in the silence, rifle in hand, waiting for the first light of dawn. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and sleep was out of the question. I sat there, tense, straining to hear any sound, any hint that whatever was out there might be coming back. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of anxiety. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. It was as if the forest itself was playing tricks on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting. I started fortifying the cabin, stacking logs against the walls and setting up traps around the perimeter. It was as if I was preparing for a siege. Couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. Sleep became a rare luxury, and when I did manage to drift off, it was only to be jolted awake by the slightest noise. Creak in the floorboards, the rustle of leaves outside. My dog, Ranger, usually my faithful companion, had started acting strange too. He'd growl at nothing, his hackles raised, staring intently at the forest as if he could see something I couldn't. His behavior only heightened my own fear. Whatever was out there, he sensed it too. As the days went on, paranoia took hold. Every creak, Every whisper of wind through the trees felt like a threat. I stopped leaving the cabin altogether, convinced that whatever was lurking out there was waiting for me to let my guard down. I could feel myself unraveling, losing touch with reality. The isolation, the fear, the constant state of alertness was wearing me down. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever, but the thought of leaving the cabin, of stepping out into those woods again, filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. I was trapped, not just by the fear of what was out there, but by my own mind, spiraling deeper into paranoia. The forest had become a prison, and I was its captive. Then came the night of the storm. The wind howled through the trees like a banshee, and the rain lashed against the cabin with a fury I hadn't seen in years. Thunder boomed, shaking the ground beneath me, and lightning split the sky in blinding flashes. Felt like the whole forest was under siege, and I was trapped in the middle of it. I huddled inside, clutching my rifle, trying to ignore the fear gnawing at my insides. But then, over the roar of the storm, I heard something else. Something that didn't belong. It was a low, guttural chanting, rising and falling in a rhythm that made my skin crawl. It was coming from all around me, seeping through the walls of the cabin as if the forest itself was whispering dark secret. Panic gripped me as I realized this wasn't just the storm. Something was out there, something far worse than anything I'd imagined. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and I felt the air around me thicken with a malevolent energy. My hands trembled as I barricaded the door with whatever I could find, praying it would hold. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the storm began to die down. The thunder became a distant rumble, the rain eased into a steady drizzle, and the chanting faded into the background. But before I could even catch my breath, I saw it, through the rain-soaked window, a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was barely visible in the mist, but its eyes, they burned like embers, piercing through the darkness and straight into my soul. I froze, paralyzed by fear, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching me. For what felt like an eternity, we were locked in that terrible stare, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Then, as the rain began to pick up again, the figure slowly dissolved into the mist, leaving nothing behind but the eerie silence of the forest. When it was gone, I slumped to the floor, drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably. The storm had passed, but the terror remained, lingering in the air like the smell of rain. That night, something ancient and malevolent had come for me, and though it had left for now, I knew it wasn't over. The morning brought no comfort. The storm had blown itself out, leaving the forest dripping and still, but inside, I was anything but calm. I couldn't shake the image of those burning eyes, the chanting that seemed to seep from the earth itself. Every sound in the forest, every creak of the trees, set my nerves on edge. I knew I had to leave. Whatever had happened that night, whatever that thing was, couldn't stay here any longer. I packed up what little I could carry, leaving most of my belongings behind. Cabin, which had been my refuge for years, felt like a trap now, a place that could no longer protect me. As I locked the door one last time, I couldn't help but feel like I was abandoning it to whatever dark presence had taken notice of me. The hike out of the woods was long, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. Every step felt like I was being watched. I never looked back. I didn't want to know if those eyes were following me. Forest, once a source of peace, was now a place of fear. I knew it held secrets far older and darker than I could ever understand. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, I didn't stop until I was back in the city. Crowds, the noise, the lights, they were a welcome distraction from the silence that had driven me out of the woods. The memory of that night stayed with me, a shadow that followed me everywhere. Years have passed since then, and I've never returned to that cabin. I tell myself that it's better this way. Some things are best left buried in the dark. But every now and then, when the night is quiet and the wind picks up just so, I swear I can still hear that chanting, feel those eyes watching me from the shadows. I've tried to move on, forget. There's a part of me that knows the truth. The forest hasn't forgotten me. It's out there, waiting, and one day it might come for me again. Until then, I keep my eyes on the horizon, always half expecting to see those burning eyes staring back at me. I moved to this cabin in the mountains to escape the noise of the world. The solitude, crisp mountain air, and the towering pines, this place was my sanctuary. But something changed last autumn. It started with the trees. I noticed strange marks carved into their bark, deep gouges that formed symbols I couldn't understand. At first, I thought it was just kids messing around, maybe some kind of prank. But the more I looked, the less it felt like a joke. There was something deliberate about those marks. Something ancient. I tried to ignore them, brushing it off as nothing, but the unease settled in. Every time I went out to gather firewood, I found more of those markings, spreading closer to my cabin. It was as if the forest itself was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't figure out what. Nights were the worst. Alone in my cabin, I'd stare out at the trees, wondering what might be out there, watching. The wind would pick up, and I'd swear I heard whispers, just on the edge of hearing, carried by the breeze. It was enough to make a man question his own mind. But I wasn't ready to be scared off by some strange carvings and a few whispers. This was my home, and I wasn't about to let fear drive me away. As the days went by, those whispers grew louder. At first, it was just faint murmurs like distant voices carried on the wind, but soon they became clearer, more insistent. I could almost make out words, though they were in a language I didn't recognize. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I tried to keep my routine normal, chopping wood, hunting for food, keeping the cabin in shape. But those whispers? They followed me everywhere. No matter where I went in the forest, they were there, echoing through the trees. It felt like the forest itself was alive, and it was trying to communicate with me. But why? And what was it trying to say? At night, the dreams started. They were vivid, filled with shadowy figures that lurked just beyond the firelight. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the whispers still echoing in my ears. Sleep became a rare and precious thing, something I craved but feared at the same time. I knew I needed to find out what was happening, but every instinct in me screamed to stay away, leave it alone. Yet something was drawing me deeper into those woods, something I couldn't explain. It was as if I was being pulled by an invisible force, compulsion I couldn't resist. One night, under a moonlit sky, I felt an overwhelming urge to venture farther than I ever had before. The whispers were louder than ever, almost like a chorus, beckoning me forward. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured out, guided by a force I couldn't quite understand. Forest was eerily quiet, the usual nocturnal sounds silenced as if in anticipation. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting strange shadows on the ground. I pushed through the underbrush, my nerves on edge, until I stumbled into a small clearing bathed in an otherworldly silver light. In the center of the clearing, ancient symbols were etched into the ground, faintly glowing in the moonlight. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, an unsettling reminder of something primordial. My heart pounded as I approached, drawn by a mix of fear and curiosity. It was then that I saw it. A figure emerging from the shadows. It was tall and thin, draped in darkness, its form shifting and undulating. Its eyes were like pools of obsidian, reflecting the light in a way that made them seem almost alive. I was paralyzed, unable to move or make a sound as the figure slowly advanced toward me. As the figure drew closer, its presence felt like a suffocating weight pressing down on me. I could barely breathe, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts and fears. The figure's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an almost physical pull, like it was searching deep within me. A voice, smooth and chilling, echoed in my mind. It spoke of ancient pacts made with blood, promises broken and debts left unpaid. The voice offered knowledge, secrets of the universe that promised unimaginable power. But there was a sinister undertone, a warning that this power came at a steep price. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The figure's voice continued, weaving a tapestry of temptation and dread. It spoke of hidden truths and forbidden wisdom, but all I could think about was the price of my own soul. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to tear my gaze away from those haunting eyes. I spun around and fled back to my cabin, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The whispers grew louder, The shadows seemed to close in on me, and the forest felt like it was alive with dark intent. When dawn finally broke, I stumbled out of the cabin, my hands still trembling. The night had felt like a twisted dream, but the lingering fear was all too real. I quickly packed what little I could carry, my mind reeling from the encounter. The forest seemed oddly quiet, almost too still, as if holding its breath. As I made my way down the mountain, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I glanced back often, half expecting to see those dark eyes peering out from the trees. Once I reached the base of the mountain, I never looked back. The cabin, once a refuge, had become a place of nightmares. I relocated to the city, seeking the safety of crowds and the brightness that kept the shadows at bay. Years have passed, and I rarely talk about my time in the mountains. The whispers that haunted me are gone, but their echoes remain in my mind. They serve as a grim reminder of the thin boundary between what is known and what lies in the dark corners of existence. The secrets of that forest are buried deep, but they continue to haunt me, a shadow I can't escape. When I first laid eyes on the cabin, nestled deep in the heart of the Appalachian woods, I felt a sense of peace that had long eluded me. Towering oaks and whispering pines seemed to embrace the little wooden structure, offering a refuge from the chaotic noise of the city, a noise I had never fully experienced, being profoundly deaf. But it was more than just an escape. This cabin was a sanctuary, a place where I could finally focus on my writing without distraction. It was 2015, and after years of trying to find a quiet space in a world filled with constant clamor, I had finally found it. The cabin was old but sturdy, creaking floorboards and a fireplace that added a warmth to the place that I hadn't felt in a long time. I could hear the fire crackling through the vibrations in the wood, and it was strangely comforting. There was something soothing about the isolation, where the only sounds were the rustling leaves outside and the distant calls of birds I could feel in my chest more than hear. First few weeks there were idyllic. I spent my days tapping away on my keyboard, words flowing effortlessly as the peaceful environment inspired me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The silence was a canvas for my thoughts, unbroken by the usual interruptions of daily life. Here I was free to think, free to create, and most importantly, free to simply be. But as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, a subtle unease began to creep in. The darkness in these woods was different, thicker, almost tangible. Yet I dismissed it as my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I had come here for solitude. I had gotten exactly what I wanted. At least, that's what I told myself. The night it all began was cold. Kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes every little sound feel sharper, more menacing. I was sitting at my desk, fingers dancing over the keys as I lost myself in the story I was weaving. Fire crackled softly behind me, and the shadows it cast flickered across the walls like ghosts from another time. I was so immersed in my work that I almost didn't notice the change in the air. A subtle shift. The room had suddenly taken a breath. It was just a fleeting sensation, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I paused, my hands hovering above the keyboard, and tried to shake off the feeling. I was alone, after all, with nothing but the trees and the wind outside. Yet there was something unsettling about the way the night felt so still, almost as if it were holding its breath too. Then I heard it, or rather, I felt it. A soft, almost imperceptible knock on the window. The vibration was faint, but unmistakable. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as my eyes darted to the window. It was too dark to see anything outside, just the reflection of the room and the fire's glow behind me. For a long moment, I stayed like that, listening with every part of me that could listen, straining to pick up any other sign that someone or something was out there. But there was nothing, just the usual creaks and groans of the cabin settling into the night. I tried to convince myself that it was just a branch tapping against the glass, or maybe even the wind, though I knew deep down that neither explanation made sense. Still, I wasn't about to let my imagination get the better of me. I forced myself to relax, took a deep breath, and went back to my writing, though the words didn't come as easily now. Minutes passed. They felt like hours. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see a face staring back at me through the darkness. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to my own mind playing tricks, but the unease gnawed at me, refusing to be ignored. Then came the second knock, louder this time, and I knew. This was no trick of the mind. The second knock sent a jolt of fear straight through me. It was unmistakable now. Someone was out there. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced myself to stay calm, though every instinct screamed at me to run. But where would I go? The cabin was isolated, surrounded by miles of dense forest. There was nowhere to run, and no one nearby to call for help. I stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound that felt too loud, too exposed. I edged closer to the window, my breath shallow, trying to peer out into the darkness without getting too close. But all I could see was my own reflection, pale and wide-eyed, against the inky black outside. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow moving just beyond the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to make out any details. At first, it was just a dark blur against the night, but then the figure stepped closer, into the faint light from the cabin. My blood ran cold. Person, or whatever it was wearing a mask, old and worn, the kind you'd see in a forgotten Halloween store. The eyes behind it were hidden, but I could feel them staring straight at me, as if they could see me through the glass and darkness. I took a step back, my mind racing. I needed to do something, anything, but I felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot by fear. The figure moved closer, and I could see now that it was tall, with a strange, deliberate way of moving, like it had all the time in the world. Panic surged through me as I realized it wasn't going to stop. It was coming for me. Cabin, which had once felt so safe and secluded, now felt like a trap. I hurried to the front door, hands trembling as I checked the lock, then double-checked it. My mind was a blur of desperate thoughts. Was there a way to barricade it? What if it wasn't enough? I raced to each window, making sure they were locked tight, but the old wood creaked ominously as if mocking my effort. Then came the sound that shattered the silence, a soft but persistent thud against the back door. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was testing the doors, trying to find a way in. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, and held it tight, my knuckles white. The weight of it was reassuring, but deep down, I knew it was a flimsy defense against whatever was outside. The thudding stopped, and for a moment, everything was quiet again. Too quiet. I strained to hear, trying to anticipate its next move. The silence stretched on, making my nerves even more raw, and then I saw it. A shadow passing by the window, slow and deliberate, as if it knew I was watching. Fear gripped me, but there was something else, too. Anger. How dare this person invade my sanctuary? I gripped the poker tighter, backing away into a corner where I could see both the door and the window, ready to defend myself if it came to that. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, made me flinch, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of the intruder. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each second dragging on as the tension built. Then, in the silence, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. A low, guttural growl, deep and primal, coming from the darkness outside. It wasn't human, and it sent a wave of terror through me that I had never felt before. This was no ordinary intruder. This was something far worse. The growl reverberated through the cabin, deep and unnatural, making every hair on my body stand on end. My grip on the poker tightened as I tried to steady my breathing, but fear had a stranglehold on me. I felt trapped, a mouse caught in a cage, with the predator circling outside. Every instinct told me to run, but there was nowhere to go. My only choice was to stand my ground and face whatever was out there. I edged toward the window, moving as quietly as I could, and peeked through the glass. The figure was closer now, just a few feet away, standing motionless in the dim light. The mask it wore was cracked and worn, the kind of thing that might have been terrifying in a cheap horror movie, but this was real. The eyes behind the mask were invisible in the shadows, but I could feel them, burning into me, the malevolence that sent shivers down my spine. Without warning, it lunged at the window, slamming against it with a force that made the glass rattle in its frame. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. as the thing outside pressed its face against the pane, the mask distorting in the light. For a moment, I thought the window would shatter, but it held, though just barely. My mind was a whirlwind of panic and terror, but I forced myself to think, act. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the figure as it continued to press against the glass, testing it, searching for a weakness. I knew it wouldn't stop. Whatever this thing was, it was relentless, determined to get inside. My gaze flickered to the fireplace, to the heavy iron poker in my hands, and I knew that if it came to it, I would have to fight. The door shuddered as the thing moved to it, rattling the handle with a violence that sent fresh waves of terror through me. I could hear the wood creaking, straining under the pressure. The cabin, once my sanctuary, now felt like a fragile barrier between me and the nightmare outside. I knew it wouldn't hold forever. The door burst open with a deafening crash, and the figure stepped inside. It stood there, framed in the doorway, its shadow stretching long and menacing across the floor. The air seemed to freeze around us, the only sound the pounding of my heart in my ears. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel its gaze locked onto me, predator toying with its prey. But something in me snapped. The fear that had paralyzed me suddenly gave way to a burning anger. How dare this thing come into my home, try to take away my peace, my life? With a surge of adrenaline, I raised the poker and swung it with all my strength. The figure moved with inhuman speed, dodging the blow and lunging at me with a force that knocked the breath out of my lungs. We crashed to the floor, and I struggled to free myself, kicking and thrashing as its masked face loomed over me. My hands scrambled for the poker, gripping it tight, and I swung again, this time connecting with a sickening thud. The thing staggered back, momentarily dazed. I scrambled to my feet, every muscle screaming in fear and fury. The fight had awakened something primal in me, a survival instinct I didn't know I had. I wasn't going to die here, not like this. With a growl of my own, I launched myself at the figure, swinging the poker with wild desperation. The mask cracked under the impact, pieces of it falling away to reveal the darkness beneath. It let out a distorted, guttural snarl, retreating as I pressed forward, each swing of the poker driving it back toward the door. Finally, with one last desperate strike, I sent it stumbling out into the night. It retreated into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had come. I stood there, breathless and shaking, staring into the darkness, waiting for it to return. But the night was silent once more, save for the sound of my ragged breathing. I didn't move, didn't dare take my eyes off the spot where it had vanished, afraid that if I did, it would come back. My whole body trembled with the aftershock of the encounter, but I knew I couldn't let my guard down. Not yet. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity as I stood there, staring into the darkness where the figure had disappeared. My heart was still pounding, adrenaline surging through my veins. Gradually, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I was alone again, but the fear that had gripped me was now tempered with a fierce determination. Whatever that thing was, I had faced it, fought it, and somehow survived. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, I finally allowed myself to move. My legs felt like jelly, and my hands were still trembling as I set the iron poker down. The cabin was a mess. The door hung crooked on its hinges, the floor scattered with debris from the struggle, but it was still standing. And so was I. I hesitated for a moment before stepping outside, cool morning air biting against my skin. The forest was quiet, almost peaceful in the early light, but I knew better now. The peace here was deceptive, hiding things in the shadows that I hadn't been prepared for. My eyes scanned the area around the cabin, searching for any sign of the intruder. But all I found were footprints in the dew-covered grass, large, heavy prints that led into the woods and then vanished among the trees. A chill ran through me as I stared at those prints, a stark reminder of the terror I had faced just hours before. But mixed with that fear was a new feeling, one I hadn't expected. Resolve. This place, this cabin, was mine. I had come here to find peace and solitude, and I wasn't about to let some masked figure, or whatever it was, chase me away. I stood there for a long time, watching the sun rise higher, its warmth gradually chasing away the lingering cold of the night. The events replayed in my mind, each detail sharp and vivid, but the more I thought about it, the more certain I became. I had survived, and not just by hiding or running. I had fought back, and I had won. As I turned to go back inside, I caught a glimpse of myself in the cracked glass of the window. My reflection was different now, still pale and shaken, but there was a fire in my eyes that hadn't been there before. This cabin had tested me, pushed me to the brink of my fear, and I had come out stronger on the other side. Back inside, the cabin felt different too. The shadows that had once seemed so menacing were now just shadows, creaks and groans of the old wood familiar rather than frightening. I began to straighten up, setting the door back in place, picking up the scattered pieces of furniture. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. When I finally sat back down at my desk, I found that my hands were steady again. The fire in the hearth had died down to embers, but I let it be. I didn't need the warmth anymore. I had something else to keep me going now, a newfound sense of purpose, determination to claim this place as my own, no matter what. As my fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to continue the story I had been writing, I couldn't help but smile. The forest outside whispered its secret. Now I knew I had the strength to listen. I was no longer just a writer seeking solitude. I was a survivor, and this cabin was more than just a retreat. It was my home, and I would defend it, no matter what the night might bring. The wilderness has always been my refuge, a place where the noise of the world fades into the background. I've spent most of my 48 years out here, far from civilization, where the air is clean, and the only company is the wildlife that roams these rugged mountains. My cabin, nestled by a clear mountain stream in the heart of Montana's backcountry, is my sanctuary. Built by my own hands, it's a modest place, just enough to keep me sheltered from the harsh elements. It's 1986, and while the world outside races forward, my days follow a different rhythm. I track wildlife, teach survival skills to those who come seeking adventure, and lose myself in the solitude that only the wilderness can offer. The towering fir trees and jagged peaks that surround me are my constant companions. Their presence a comfort I've come to rely on. The crisp autumn air is a reminder that winter isn't far off, and with it comes a different kind of challenge. Out here, the seasons dictate everything. When the leaves start to turn, there's a shift. A reminder that the days are growing shorter and the nights colder. It's a time to prepare, to make sure the cabin is ready for the snow that will inevitably blanket the ground. But it's also a time of beauty, when the forest comes alive with color and the wildlife is more active, getting ready for the long months ahead. I've always been content in this life. There's a peace in the routine, in knowing that out here, it's just me and the land. Quiet is something I've come to cherish. It's a silence that speaks volumes, filled with the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an eagle, the babble of the stream as it winds its way through the forest. But as autumn deepens, I can't shake the feeling that something is different this year. There's a tension in the air, a sense that the wilderness isn't as welcoming as it once was. That night, the storm rolled in like a beast from the mountains, bringing with it a biting wind and sheets of rain that hammered against the roof. I sat by the fire, a cup of hot tea warming my hands, listening to the howling wind as it tore through the trees. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, ominous sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. It was the kind of night where you're glad to be indoors, sheltered from the fury of nature. But as I stared into the flames, lost in thought, something caught my eye. Flicker of movement just outside the window. I looked up, expecting to see a branch swaying in the wind or an animal scurrying by, but what I saw made my heart skip a beat. There, at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. It stood motionless, shrouded in darkness, barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the light, the storm playing games with my mind. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became that I wasn't imagining things. I stood up, peering through the rain-streaked glass, my pulse quickening. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching, my gut twisted with unease. I'm no stranger to the dangers of the wild, but this was different. This wasn't a bear or a wolf. It was something else, something that didn't belong. Eventually, the figure melted back into the woods, swallowed by the darkness. I stood there for a long time, staring into the spot where it had been, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The storm raged on, but inside, the fire had lost its warmth. Couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the wilderness wasn't as safe as it once was. And as the night wore on, that feeling only grew stronger, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The days that followed were marked by an unsettling quiet. Every rustle outside, every groan of the cabin's old timbers seemed amplified in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew longer, I found myself on edge, expecting something or someone to appear. Strange occurrences became the norm. I'd hear footsteps crunching on the gravel path outside, only to find nothing there when I opened the door. The whispers of the wind through the trees took on an eerie quality, as if they were carrying secret messages. I checked and rechecked the locks on the windows and doors, fortifying my defenses as best I could, but the feeling of vulnerability persisted. I spent more time scanning the perimeter of my cabin, searching for signs of an intruder. The forest remained as silent as ever. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Nothing seemed out of place. I knew the wilderness could play tricks on the mind, especially in the autumn, when the world itself seemed to be preparing for the long, cold months ahead. Yet something about this felt real, and it wasn't just my imagination running wild. One night the tension reached a boiling point. The moon was full, casting a silver glow over the landscape. I lay in bed, wide awake, straining to hear any hint of movement. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional distant rumble of thunder. As I stared at the ceiling, I realized the presence I'd felt wasn't staying away. It was drawing closer, probing for weaknesses in my defenses, like a predator testing its prey. I decided then that I needed to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows. I couldn't live like this, always on edge, always waiting for the next unsettling encounter. The feeling of being watched, the strange noises, it all had to stop. And so, with a mix of fear and determination, I prepared myself for whatever lay ahead. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape as I ventured into the forest. Cold air bit at my skin, and the trees loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long and thin in the moonlight. I carried my rifle tightly, each step careful, my senses heightened. The stillness of the night was both a comfort and a curse, amplifying every sound. Crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustle of branches swaying in the wind. I moved cautiously, my lantern cutting through the darkness in a narrow beam. The forest seemed to hold its breath as I navigated the tangled undergrowth, every nerve on edge. I scanned the ground for any sign of the figure that had been haunting me. The anticipation was almost unbearable, a mix of dread and resolve pushing me forward. Then, a sudden movement in the underbrush made me freeze. My heart pounded in my chest as I swung my lantern in the direction of the sound. There, partially hidden among the shadows, stood the figure I had glimpsed from the cabin. He was a man dressed in ragged clothes, his eyes glinting with an unsettling mixture of desperation and malice. The sight of him sent a shiver down my spine. We locked eyes, a silent standoff that seemed to stretch on forever. I could see the weariness etched into his face, a man who had been living on the edge of survival. There was something primal about the encounter, a clash of instincts as raw and untamed as the wilderness itself. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, his gaze piercing through the darkness. Finally, his voice broke the silence, rough and strained. He spoke of isolation, of a life lived on the fringes of society, far removed from the safety and structure of the outside world. His words carried a weight of desperation, a stark reflection of the harsh realities of survival. There was an element of danger in his presence, but also a profound sadness, a recognition of the thin line that separates civilization from the wild. In that moment, I saw the man not just as a threat, but as a fellow human, shaped by the same unforgiving wilderness that had shaped me. His story resonated with me in a way I hadn't expected. Beneath the fear, there was a shared understanding, a recognition of the isolation that comes with living so close to nature's edge. We were both products of this vast, unyielding land, struggling to navigate its dangers and demands. The confrontation wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about survival and connection. A realization that even in the depths of the wilderness, the shadows of humanity linger, shaping the stories we tell and the lives we lead. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, I guided the man back to a place of safety. The forest was waking up around us, the birds beginning their morning songs, the chill of the night retreating in the warmth of the rising sun. The tension that had gripped me for so long started to ease, replaced by a weary sense of relief. We reached the edge of the forest where the man would be able to find some shelter and a way to get help. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of his struggles etched into his worn face. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, a shared acknowledgement of the harsh realities that both of us faced. It was a connection forged in the crucible of survival, a moment of empathy born from the trials of the wilderness. As he disappeared back into the forest, I felt a strange mix of emotions. The fear and anxiety that had consumed me for weeks were giving way to a contemplative silence. I was left alone once more, but the solitude felt different. It was no longer just a refuge from the world, but a space where I had confronted and survived a real threat. The cabin, once a haven of peace, now seemed to hold the echoes of that night's events. The scars of the confrontation were visible, the disturbed ground, the broken branches where we had walked. Yet amidst these reminders, there was a newfound clarity. The wilderness had tested me in ways I hadn't anticipated, pushing me to confront not just external threats, but also my own fears and vulnerabilities. As I resumed my daily routine, the forest around me seemed to whisper in a new way. The silence was no longer ominous, filled with a deeper understanding. I continued with my work, tracking wildlife and teaching survival skills. But there was a layer of awareness now, a recognition of the delicate balance between isolation and connection. The autumn nights came and went, each one a reminder of the fragility of solitude and the shadows of humanity that linger even in the most remote places. The events of that fateful night remained etched in my memory, a testament to the raw, unpredictable nature of life in the wild. In the end, I realized that the wilderness wasn't just a backdrop for survival. It was a living, breathing entity that held within it the threads of our deepest fears and our greatest strength. In 1994, I made a choice that would haunt me forever. I moved into an old farmhouse deep in the heart of rural Pennsylvania. Nestled among the dense forest, the place offered complete isolation from the world. At first, the solitude felt liberating, perfect escape from the clamor and chaos of city life. The silence was a balm, allowing me to find a new rhythm in the tranquility of nature. I spent my days enjoying the peace, finding comfort in the snowy landscape and the crisp winter air. The farmhouse, though old and worn, became a sanctuary. I reveled in the simplicity, relishing the quiet moments that came with living so far from civilization. But as the days turned into weeks, the isolation began to shift from a refuge into something unsettling. The once soothing silence grew heavy, as if it carried with it an undercurrent of something ominous. The peace I had embraced started to feel like a facade, hiding a growing sense of unease. First signs of disturbance were subtle, almost imperceptible. Little things, like footprints in the snow that led to nowhere, began to unsettle me. There was no one else for miles, so who could have made them? Strange noises drifted through the forest at night, rustling leaves with no wind to stir them, faint whispers that seemed to float just out of reach. What had started as a dream of peaceful isolation was beginning to unravel, leaving me with an uneasy feeling that something was very wrong. As the weeks went by, the unsettling signs began to pile up. It started with small, almost imperceptible clues. I would find footprints in the snow, circling property, despite the fact that no one lived nearby. They were always there and then gone, vanishing as mysteriously as they had appeared. At night, the forest outside my windows came a realm of eerie sounds. There were rustlings in the underbrush that shouldn't have been there, as if unseen creatures were moving around. Leaves would shift and crackle when the wind was still, and I'd hear whispers that seemed to float just beyond my hearing. I would lie awake in bed, straining to make sense of the noises, but nothing ever seemed to be out of place when I checked. The disturbances gradually grew more persistent. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, my sense of security slipping away. The once comforting silence of the forest was now a backdrop to my growing unease. The feeling of being watched became an almost constant companion, as if unseen eyes were always tracking my every move. Each new occurrence piled onto the last, feeding a sense of dread that I could never quite shake. What had once been a tranquil retreat was turning into something far more sinister, leaving me questioning the true nature of peace I had sought. One frigid December evening, while I was chopping wood outside, I saw something that froze me in place. Through the dense fog that had settled over the forest, a figure emerged at the edge of the tree line. It was tall and unnaturally thin, blending almost seamlessly with the darkness around it. Its eyes glowed with a chilling, otherworldly light. I stood there, unable to move, as the figure seemed to survey me from a distance. It was as if time had stopped, the icy air biting at my skin while my heart raced in my chest. The figure remained motionless, its gaze fixed on me, with an intensity that felt both hypnotic and terrifying. Suddenly, it vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone in the cold and silence. The encounter left me shaken. The image of that glowing-eyed specter burned into my mind. The forest, once a place of refuge, now seemed to close in around me, darkness more oppressive than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The figure had appeared so suddenly, and its presence was so unsettling that I found it hard to sleep that night. The fear was no longer just a creeping sensation. It was a palpable, living thing that haunted me whenever I was alone. The nights grew increasingly unbearable after that encounter. Every sound seemed magnified, every creak and groan of the old house louder than usual. I would wake up to scratching noises on the windows, like long, sharp claws tapping against the glass. The disturbances were so persistent that I began to dread the fall of darkness. On nights with a full moon, I'd catch fleeting glimpses of twisted figures moving between the trees. Their silhouettes were elongated and distorted, giving the impression of something not entirely human. Even my dog, usually brave and loyal, was profoundly affected. He would whimper and hide in corners, refusing to go outside after sunset. One particularly cold night in February, the farmhouse was shaken by a violent force. I stumbled out into the freezing night air, my heart pounding, find the barn doors flapping wildly. Inside, the hay was scattered as if a storm had passed through. There were no signs of a break-in, no tracks leading to or from the barn, just the unsettling sensation of being watched. The growing intensity of these incidents was eroding my sanity. I felt trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Each night brought new terrors, and the once familiar surroundings of my home now seemed to harbor an unspoken menace. Desperation drove me to seek answers from the nearby town. The locals were evasive, speaking in hushed tones and avoiding my gaze. Finally, an elderly woman in a small, dimly lit store took pity on me. She whispered about the land's dark history. A secretive cult had once performed rituals in these woods. They spoke of sacrifices and dark invocations, of restless souls that never found peace. As the days passed, my fear turned into frantic paranoia. I barricaded doors and windows, clutching a shotgun loaded with silver bullets. Every creak and rustle set my nerves on edge. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. One moonless night in March, as I sat by the dying embers of my fire, a voice whispered my name. It wasn't from outside, from within the house. My heart raced as the voice grew louder, echoing through the empty rooms. Leave, ist, or join us. Panicked, I fled into the cold night, leaving everything behind. I ran down the winding dirt road, desperate to escape the cursed place. Even now, years later, the memories haunt me. The sensation of being watched, the sinister whispers, they linger, a chilling reminder that some horrors never truly leave us. They remain in the shadows, waiting for the next unwary soul to cross their path. So, dear listener, if you feel drawn to the allure of solitude in the heart of darkness, be wary. For in those forgotten places, where the veil between worlds is thin, there are things that defy reason and prey on the unwary, hungry for the terror that fuels their existence. On nights with a full moon, I'd catch fleeting glimpses of twisted figures moving between the trees. Their silhouettes were elongated and distorted, giving the impression of something not entirely human. Even my dog, usually brave and loyal, was profoundly affected. He would whimper and hide in corners, refusing to go outside after sunset. One particularly cold night in February, the farmhouse was shaken by a violent force. I stumbled out into the freezing night air, my heart pounding, find the barn doors flapping wildly. Inside, the hay was scattered as if a storm had passed through. There were no signs of a break-in, no tracks leading to or from the barn, just the unsettling sensation of being watched. The growing intensity of these incidents was eroding my sanity. I felt trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Each night brought new terrors, and the once familiar surroundings of my home now seemed to harbor an unspoken menace. Desperation drove me to seek answers from the nearby town. The locals were evasive, speaking in hushed tones and avoiding my gaze. Finally, an elderly woman in a small, dimly lit store took pity on me. She whispered about the land's dark history. A secretive cult had once performed rituals in these woods. They spoke of sacrifices and dark invocations, restless souls that never found peace. As the days passed, my fear turned into frantic paranoia. I barricaded doors and windows, clutching a shotgun loaded with silver bullets. Every creak and rustle set my nerves on edge. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. One moonless night in March, as I sat by the dying embers of my fire, a voice whispered my name. It wasn't from outside, from within the house. My heart raced as the voice grew louder, echoing through the empty rooms. Leave, or join us. Panicked, I fled into the cold night, leaving everything behind. I ran down the winding dirt road, desperate to escape the cursed place. Even now, years later, the memories haunt me. The sensation of being watched, the sinister whispers, they linger, a chilling reminder that some horrors never truly leave us. They remain in the shadows, waiting for the next unwary soul to cross their path. So, dear listener, if you feel drawn to the allure of solitude in the heart of darkness, be wary, for in those forgotten places, where the veil between worlds is thin, there are things that defy reason and prey on the unwary, hungry for the terror that fuels their existence. In the summer of 1984, I made a hasty choice to live off the grid in an old cabin hidden deep within the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. The cabin was worn and forgotten, surrounded by towering pines and overlooking a tranquil lake that sparkled under the summer sun. At first, it was a perfect escape from the chaos of city life. Days passed with fishing in the calm lake and exploring the dense forest encircling my new home. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the serene setting began to change. Shadows grew menacing along the cabin's walls, and the rustling leaves outside turned into unsettling whispers carried by the wind. One muggy August night, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps on the creaking porch. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and peered cautiously through the window. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, shrouded in darkness. I shouted, but the only response was the eerie echo of my own voice against the silence. As weeks passed, unsettling occurrences became more frequent. Objects mysteriously shifted from their places while I slept. The radio, once a source of comfort with its soft music and weather updates, crackled with static and voices in an unknown language. Each morning, strange symbols appeared on the cabin's walls, pulsating with an eerie, unsettling energy. On a moonless night, a fierce storm rolled in. Thunder rattled the cabin, and lightning flashed across the forest, casting wild, irregular shadows. Through the tempest, I caught glimpses of figures darting between the trees, their forms twisted and elongated, like phantoms from a nightmare. Desperate for answers, I went to the nearest town, a sleepy village miles away. The locals, wary and reticent, spoke in hushed tones about a curse haunting the land. They told stories of a logging community that had met a tragic end, leaving behind restless, vengeful spirits roaming the woods. Returning to the cabin, dread weighed heavily on me. I felt eyes on me constantly, and sleep became elusive. Nightmares plagued my waking hours, visions of ghostly figures scratching at the door, their wails piercing the quiet. In a final act of desperation, I found an old journal left by a previous occupant. Its pages described rituals under the full moon, attempts to appease the spirits of the forest. My blood ran cold as I realized the cabin was a portal. place between worlds, and I had trespassed on sacred ground. With shaking hands, I packed my belongings and fled into the night. Even now, as I try to rebuild my life far from those cursed woods, I can't escape the knowledge that some places are not meant for the living. The spirits of the past linger, forever haunting the land, waiting for those who dare to disturb their eternal rest. Summer of 1994. I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. My name is Jack Thompson, and I moved to a remote farm in the heart of rural Oregon, seeking solitude away from the city's clamor. The farm was nestled deep in the forest, miles from the nearest neighbor. I was drawn to the isolation, hoping to escape the constant noise and find peace. Instead, what I found was something far darker. From the moment I arrived, there was something unsettling about the place. The house was old, dating back to the late 1800s. The previous owners had vanished long ago, leaving no trace. Locals spoke of the place in hushed tones. I dismissed their warnings as superstition, but now I wish I had taken them more seriously. The first few days were eerily quiet, almost too quiet. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making you question if it's really peaceful. I kept myself busy fixing up the old barn and clearing overgrown fields. But even amidst the tasks, an undercurrent of unease lingered. The initial days passed in an unsettling calm. I thought the silence was a blessing, a respite from the city's chaos. But soon, quiet started to feel stifling, as though it were pressing in on me. By the fifth night, I noticed something odd. I was lying in bed, trying to relax, when I heard a faint scratching sound coming from the attic. It was a soft, persistent noise, like nails scraping against wood. I told myself it was just the house settling, a common sound in old buildings. Yet deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, sleep was elusive. My mind replayed the sound over and over, each time growing more ominous. I knew I had to investigate. Determined to get to the bottom of the noise, I ventured into the attic. The space was dark and dusty, filled with forgotten relics. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. Among the clutter of old furniture, dusty trunks, and faded photographs, I spotted a weathered leather journal on top of a wooden chest. Its cover was worn, the edges frayed from years of neglect. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened the diary, and what I read sent a chill down my spine. The entries detailed a man who had lived in the house over a century ago. He wrote about hearing voices and seeing shadows at the edges of his vision. As the entries progressed, his writing became more frantic, describing figures lurking outside the windows and whispers in the dark. The final entry was a cryptic warning. They come when it's darkest. Pray you're not alone. The disturbances grew worse after that night. I began to notice subtle changes. A door left ajar in the attic, despite my careful locking of it, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The feeling of being watched intensified with each passing night. One stormy evening, the true terror struck. The wind howled through the trees like a banshee, rattling the windows and shaking the house. I was trying to sleep when a loud crash jolted me awake. I grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs to find the source of the noise. The kitchen window had shattered, rain pouring in and flooding the floor. As I stood there trying to process what had happened, I heard another thud, this time from the basement. Reluctantly, I descended into the pitch-black space. Flashlight's beam barely cut through the darkness, and the air was cold and damp. At the foot of the stairs, I saw a dark shape move across the room. My heart raced, and I called out, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. I moved closer to where the figure had been, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. There, huddled in the corner, was a dark, indistinct shape. My flashlight flickered and then went out. As I fumbled with the batteries, the shape vanished. The basement was empty. The fear lingered like a heavy fog. The next morning, I packed my things and prepared to leave. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. As I drove away from the farm, I glanced back at the old house. The wind had picked up, making the building sway and creak as if it were alive. Weeks later, back in town, I sought out an elderly woman who had lived in the area her whole life. I recounted my experiences and showed her the diary. Her face turned pale as she read through the entry. She shared a chilling story I had never heard before. Years ago, a family had vanished from that same farmhouse. The authorities found no trace of them, just their belongings left behind. The townsfolk believed the house was cursed. They spoke of whispers on the wind and figures appearing in shadows. As she spoke, a shiver ran down my spine. The stories I'd dismissed as superstition were true. The house was not just old, it was haunted. Whatever force had driven the previous occupants to disappear had almost claimed me as well. I left the farm behind, but the memories, the fear, and the shadows remained. They say you should never seek out ghosts. Sometimes they find you anyway. If you ever find yourself driving through the Oregon woods and come across an abandoned farmhouse, don't stop, don't look. Just keep driving. Some things are better left undisturbed. In the sweltering summer of 1975, I made a choice that would forever change my life. 62, I, Victor Martin, settled into a remote ranch in West Texas, seeking solace far from the clamor of civilization. The vast, sun-baked landscape of the Chihuahuan Desert stretched endlessly before me, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos I had left behind. Inheriting this property from a distant relative, I hoped it would provide the peace I desperately craved. The ranch house loomed in front of me, dilapidated and worn by the relentless sun and unforgiving winds. Its peeling paint and sagging roof told stories of years gone by. Despite its state, I felt a sense of nostalgia as I approached, imagining the life it once held. The isolation that enveloped me was both liberating and unsettling. I had always dreamed of escaping the bustle of the city, but now, as I stood alone in this desolate place, an uneasy quiet pressed in from all sides. From the moment I stepped inside, the house felt alive, speaking and groaning as if it had secrets to share. I dismissed the sounds, chalking them up to the age of the building. After a long day of unpacking, I finally settled into bed, hoping the silence would lull me to sleep. Sleep eluded me. I found myself staring at the ceiling, the shadows dancing in the moonlight, my mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. On my first night, an unusual sound broke through the stillness. Faint scraping noise drifted in from the barn just beyond my window. My heart raced as I strained to listen, convinced it was merely the wind playing tricks on my mind. The barn had been a ruin, walls sagging and its roof caved in. I convinced myself it was nothing, figment of my imagination, and eventually drifted off, though not without a lingering sense of unease. The next day, I set about repairing the barn, eager to make the place my own. As I dug through the dust and debris, I stumbled upon a rusted padlock half buried in the ground. Curiosity piqued, pried it open, revealing a hidden compartment in the barn's floor. Inside, I discovered old crates filled with items that felt out of place. Faded photographs, dusty books, and a wooden box adorned with strange symbols. Though a sense of foreboding washed over me, I tucked the box away, deciding to explore its contents later. Little did I know, this would be the beginning of a series of unsettling events that would haunt me for weeks to come. The days passed, each one blending into the next as I settled into my new life. The silence of the desert was profound, occasionally broken by the distant cries of birds or the rustling of the wind through the sparse vegetation. My routines quickly took shape, repairing the barn, tending to the property, and adjusting to the isolation. Yet, despite my efforts to immerse myself in work, a nagging feeling of discomfort lingered. One morning, as the sun beat down relentlessly, I returned to the barn to continue my repairs. The rusted padlock I had found earlier caught my eye. I couldn't shake the urge to investigate further. I pried open the hidden compartment with a crowbar, old wood groaning in protest. Dust and debris poured out, revealing a trove of forgotten artifacts. Among the items were old, weathered photographs of people I didn't recognize, their faces obscured by age and grime. There were also dusty books with cracked spines, their pages yellowed and fragile. But the most intriguing find was a wooden box, intricately carved with symbols that seemed almost otherworldly. I couldn't help but feel a chill as I touched the box, its surface cold and unwelcoming. I decided not to open it immediately, opting to inspect its contents later when I could fully focus on what lay inside. As the days wore on, the feeling of being watched grew more pronounced. Shadows seemed to dance at the edge of my vision, and the barn door would creak open on its own, despite my efforts to keep it shut. The sense of isolation, which I had initially sought, now felt oppressive. The desert landscape, once so vast and open, now seemed to close in around me, amplifying my growing sense of unease. One evening, I sat on the porch, the setting sun casting long shadows across the desert. I found myself staring at the wooden box, which I had left in a corner of the barn. It seemed to beckon me with its strange symbols and mysterious aura. The curiosity that had initially driven me to uncover its secrets now evolved into a deep, unsettling feeling. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next day, I planned to open the box and discover what it contained, though a part of me feared what I might find. Following morning, I approached the barn with a mixture of dread and curiosity. The sun was already blazing in the sky, casting harsh shadows on the ground. I carried the wooden box carefully, its strange symbols catching the light. The barn felt different, as though it was holding its breath in anticipation. My heart pounded as I set the box down and fumbled with its latch. When I finally pried the box open, I was met with a collection of old letters and a leather-bound journal. The letters were yellowed and brittle, their ink faded with time. The journal, on the other hand, was in surprisingly good condition. Flipped through its pages, each entry penned in a shaky hand. The writing spoke of a man named Elias Thompson, who had once lived on this very ranch. Elias's entries started out mundane, detailing daily life on the ranch. But as the pages progressed, his tone grew more frantic. He wrote about hearing strange noises and seeing shadows flit across his property. His descriptions were eerily similar to what I had been experiencing. Elias spoke of a growing paranoia, as if something unseen was always lurking just out of sight. One entry was particularly chilling. Elias described a night when he saw a figure standing in the barn, only for it to vanish before his eye. The sensation of being watched, which had been a mere discomfort before, now felt like a heavy presence pressing in on me. Couldn't ignore the parallels between his experiences and my own. That evening, as the sun set and darkness enveloped the ranch, the disturbances grew more intense. The barn door creaked open with a loud groan, despite my previous efforts to secure it. Shadows seemed to stretch and warp under the moonlight, and the wind howled through the empty spaces. The uneasy feeling that had been creeping up on me now felt like an almost tangible force. I decided to delve deeper into the journal, hoping it might provide some answers, or, at the very least, a way to make sense of the growing terror that seemed to seep into every corner of my new home. The next morning, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. The journal's revelations weighed heavily on my mind as I prepared for the day. I knew I needed to investigate further, so I returned to the barn with the leather-bound journal in hand. I spread out the pages on a makeshift table and tried to piece together Elias's experiences with my own unsettling occurrences. The journal detailed Elias's attempts to find the source of the disturbances. He had come up empty-handed. He described shadowy figures and whispers that seemed to come from the very desert itself. His entries became increasingly erratic, filled with paranoia and fear. I couldn't ignore the sense of familiarity that echoed through his words. The more I read, the more I felt as though I was walking in his footsteps. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I decided to follow a lead mentioned in the journal. Elias had referenced a map tucked into the back of the journal, indicating a specific location in the desert. With the sun beating down, I ventured into the arid landscape, guided by the map's directions. Terrain was harsh, with nothing but sand and sparse vegetation for miles. After hours of trudging through the desert, I finally reached the marked spot, a small, dilapidated shack buried in the sand. The shack looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, I found remnants of a past life. Old furniture covered in dust, broken picture frames, and an ornate mirror hanging on the wall. The mirror was particularly unsettling. It had a dark stain that resembled a handprint. I felt a chill as I stared at it, the air around me growing colder. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a growing sense of dread. I hurried back to the ranch, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the shack. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The wind howled outside, and the shadows seemed to come alive, stretching and distorting in the moonlight. The sense of foreboding that had been building now felt like an inescapable reality, pressing in on me from all sides. The more I uncovered about Elias's past, the more I felt drawn into a terrifying pattern that I couldn't quite understand. That night, as the desert air turned chillier, I was unable to shake the ominous feeling that had settled over me. I lay in bed, my mind racing with the events of the past few days. The mirror from the shack seemed to haunt my thoughts, and every creak of the house seemed magnified in the silence. Just as I started to drift off, a sound from outside jolted me awake. Footsteps in the sand echoed through the night, growing closer with each passing moment. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight, my hands shaking as I stepped outside. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the property, and the wind howled like a mournful spirit. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the darkness, but I saw nothing except the shifting shadows of the desert. The footsteps, however, continued, accompanied by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around me. The feeling of being pursued was overwhelming. I followed the sounds to the barn, its old timbers groaning as the wind forced its way through. Inside, I found the barn shrouded in darkness, the flashlight's beam cutting through the gloom. The wooden box was still there, untouched since I last saw it. My heart raced as I approached, feeling as if an unseen presence was closing in on me. I opened the box again, but this time, the journal and letters seemed to hold even more weight, as if they were somehow drawing power from the night. As I turned to leave, a sudden gust of cold air swept through the barn. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. The whispering grew louder, almost urgent. I spun around, my rifle trained on the source of the noise, but I saw nothing. The shadows seemed to twist and stretch, and I could hear heavy breathing right behind me. Panic surged through me as I struggled to find my flashlight. In the pitch-black barn, the whispers became clearer, forming the words, "Go away." The air grew colder, and the sense of a malevolent presence became almost tangible. I could make out a dark, formless shape moving toward me, though my flashlight refused to turn back on. The oppressive silence followed as the shape seemed to dissolve into the night, leaving behind a suffocating stillness. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was no longer alone. With a final glance around the barn, I fled to the house, my mind racing with the terror of the unknown. The next morning, I packed my belongings with a sense of urgency. The ranch, once a beacon of solitude, now felt like a trap. As I drove away, I looked back at the old house, its silhouette framed against the rising sun. A feeling of dread still lingered, and I knew I would never return. The ranch remained vacant, a ghostly reminder of the unexplained terror that had nearly claimed me. The desert wind whispered through the barren land, carrying with it the echoes of a man who had been lost to the shadows. For those who might venture too close, the desert held its secrets tightly, waiting for the next soul to seek answers.